The Arizona Center for the Book presents Southwest Book Chats, a series of conversations about selected titles from the Pima County Public Library's Southwest Books of the Year. Join us as we discuss 6 books that address the challenges and the triumphs of our communities. We will explore, celebrate, and share stories that make Arizona's literary landscape one of the richest in the country. This project is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives and Public Records, a division of the Arizona Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The Missing Morningstar is a top pick for the Pima County Public Library's 2024 edition of Southwest Books of the Year. Reviewer Gregory McNamee writes, "In the Diné Nation, the setting of Denetsosie's collection, collisions are frequent and inevitable between imported religions and traditional beliefs, between police officers and civilians, between men and women. The desert harbors many forgotten things, and many other things in danger of disappearing, such as a beauty pageant queen who mysteriously vanishes. Beguiling with quiet humor that pierces through even the darkest moments, Denetsosie's stories mark a promising beginning. Lindsey Allison Curley and Yitazba Largo-Anderson are poets and librarians who bring a deeply personal angle to their conversation about a book that brings hope and beauty out of tragedy and challenge."
Yat'e she'e Yitazba yeneshye, ashehe nishle, se nacho bitli dashache, biligana dashanale, biligane bashishchin, akot ego dene atzan nishle. Hello, everyone. My name is Yitazba. I am from the Salt Clan and the Sleeping Rock Clan. I am Navajo. And I am really excited to be here. And I also work at the Labriola National American Indian Data Center as a program coordinator.
Hello, everybody. Yate She'e Lindsey Curley Ineshia, Kinthachini Neshla, Oze Shina Bashashin, Hashkad Totni Dashache, Tetnazana Dashanella. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay. I'm really happy to be here today. I am Red House Clan. I'm born for the Hopi Salt Clan. Currently, I'm a tween services librarian with the Pima County Public Library, and I'm also a poet.
Is there a question that jumps out at you that you want to discuss?
It's so interesting how, because I've been thinking about even how to answer the first one, and
Mm,
that's kind of like how I not necessarily approached the whole thing, but since I had it in my mind, there was like elements that I was fighting within the book about how does this book fit into the Arizona literary tradition, and I was like thinking, well, do we even have like a community of like profound like Arizona writers, and I was like kind of taking it from there. Of course, we have like Ophelia Cepeda. We even have our Mexican and Spanish like relatives like in Arizona that write fabulous books. And so I was just like thinking, well, I guess in terms of how I'm interpreting this question is how does it fit within the Arizona landscape? That was kind of like how I was like going with it. And
mhm,
so I felt like during the Missing Morningstar, she had a lot of these wonderful descriptions of the landscape. Like she's like, oh, in like K-Town, or she'll describe even like the ditches. Like I think even in that first um, the short story, which I kind of like to just call them vignettes. Like
mhm,
little snippets of like these like moments in people's lives that either become like like a memory, but more so something that gets replayed in their head. And so like even with that first line of the book, I'm just gonna open to it right here. So it says, I was taught from a young age that the earth was sacred, yet every 2 weeks or so, I'd back my little truck up to the edge of the divergent jam and throw garbage into the gorge below. And she's like talking about how the trash will like go down like the red color like canyons almost and like going into the water. And so things like that were like the thing like the main things that when we think of home, because like even here, like even though I was born and raised in Tucson, there's things here that are so like regionally based knowledge. And I know like with your library, I know that you take these approaches to at Labriola, that the landscape is much different than it starts going north of Tucson. And so a lot of these things kind of pinpoint to that storytelling. And Arizona in general, in terms of its biomes, is very diverse. And so I think that's why a lot of people, even in like the tourist economy and everything like that, love coming to Arizona because of that diversity of plant relatives that we know. And so even when you continue to keep going north, it's almost like the more beautiful that it gets. But even in beauty, in the sense that she was talking about the desert, like, think I have it marked off. I know I do somewhere about the beauty and survival, and then definitely how language relates to landscape as well. And so I'm not really too sure how to like go from this besides just kind of talking about like the little I guess like those little glimmers that you see in the book that you just like really resonate with. And
Mhm.
as a book, it's really lovely to be like a member of like the Navajo community and then have something like completely in written form just kind of represent those little vignettes in our own lives too. Even though it's not entirely our experiences, they're still like reminiscent of the things that we still experience.
Yeah, that was really beautifully put. I completely agree with everything that you talked about. And as you said, like the diversity of the land, there's also like diversity with like tribal nations in Arizona, which I really love.
Yeah.
Um, and like the book, it's like all diverse experiences, but I found kind of like a piece of myself or even know of someone who has gone through something similar with some of these characters. And when you mentioned land and language, I marked this because on page 8 on the in the first book, she talks about you don't just forget the taste of your first language. It sticks to your tongue like sour weed and juniper resin. Only in the desert can forgotten things still flourish. And so that like
Yes.
memory is in the land and like our language is in the land and
Yeah.
experiences. So when
Mhm.
you said that, that stood out to me.
I have a post-it here when she mentions that language is frenetic and like even if how because in this passage where she's using it as a simile, but when I took the like out of it, frenetic is running my hands along the crackled lichen of a sun-warmed salmon-colored canyon wall. And then when I had reread this passage and that it was like frenetic, it was like it came like in return to me. And so it's like that act of like when you are walking and you stick your hands out to something, it'll kind of just like return to you and you can kind of like feel the little divots in it and you can feel like the sounds again, you can feel how it feels between your fingers type stuff. And so in this um what is it called? I think the first one is called Dormant because it's in reference to the dormant volcano. Um Very interesting how um this character is a teenager and so eloquently puts how language returns to her, even though like she had explicated, oh, I was very fluent when I was little and people would remark in the community that I was very good at it. And then that fishing kind of like motion, she was just like, it's funny because it still lives in me. And
Mhm.
so I guess like land and like language are very interconnected in that way, especially with like how names are given and how descriptive they are. And so it's very refreshing to kind of have language be told this way as a written tradition because it's just a little snippet of how we both know the oral tradition functions in terms of um, stories being an act of generational wealth. And so that's why I appreciated the little vignettes, because it's just like they're little snippets, but you almost can rewrite the rest of it because we have already the passages within ourselves too.
Mhm. I guess like a theme that stood out to me was like the different aspects of like mother and daughter relationships or mother and like child relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the first one, like the mom is very, I thought it was really interesting when the character talked about like her mom being asleep and like how she like compared her to a volcano that was just like so big in her life and so very present. And then and yet like the mom isn't, you know, as always a great as mom as she could be,
Mm-hmm.
because she does deal with alcoholism. And yet like I see that really deep love that her child has for her. And like I thought that was really, really touching because that's kind of like a true reality for a lot of people that I know. And despite like family members dealing with like alcoholism or drug abuse, like they still have that deep love for that person, especially like as a mom, because in our tradition, like the matriarch is really huge. Um, and I really also loved Wool Dolls, the relationship of the mom with the child in that, because I just love how protective the mom is. And at the end of the story, she like fixes her daughter's doll, which in my mind kind of reflected like the daughter, like the doll was the daughter. And
Mm-hmm.
she was like violated by that
Amos.
teenage boy. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and like how he just threw the doll and just didn't like have any respect towards it. And then the mom like repaired the doll, and I just thought that was really touching.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah.
I
But,
um I very frequently, especially like in like our library discipline, always like really think about the idea of repairing something, because I think that
Mhm,
in a lot of like Western traditions, there's like that. There's even a phrase like you can't fix what is broken. Like there's like that phrase, but I think that in our communities we have this like idea of if something is broken, we have a ceremony for it. And so I
mhm,
think in that particular Wool Doll story, the that girl had already expressed that her grandmother had Alzheimer's, and so there was there was already kind of a knowing that her grandmother wasn't going to be doing her coming of age ceremony, and
mhm.
so the act of repairing that doll at the end almost was like that was her ceremony that her mom was like able to do like within her like even though like her mom was like limited and like maybe doing the preparations for her ceremony, but but she utilized her strength of like making the dolls to prepare that one that was broken. And so it was like that last scene where she's looking at her mom again, like she's laying down and she's kind of describing how the bun, the CF, was like fixed and rewrapped again, and everything was put back in place. And I guess instead of like the plastic beads that were mended onto it, now it was like it was updated with like turquoise beads. And so I was like, man, that's really neat because I think in that way she was able to have a little bit of a ceremony done after, you know, when like women are expected to kind of like handle um I don't know, like certain violent instances with like the violation of that Amos dude. She at least was able to kind of be mended in that way with like her mom in the way that she could be like helping her daughter. So I did like that
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, you know, I didn't catch that. I really appreciate you like putting that together. Yeah, I love that relationship and like that repairing. And then also like wool itself with like I guess the identity with like women too. Like my grandma like grew up herding sheep, and like that's a very common experience for us. And like I remember her carding the wool, and so just like picturing the mom here doing that work, and it just resonated with me. Makes me miss home.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I know that when I was reading a lot of these like pages, because it's like, like I was born and raised in Tucson. So like how I was reading this book is like I wonder how like me looking at these pages, it almost seems like in terms of like how we think of a land acknowledgement statement, like even me living here like in Tucson, like I'm still considered a visitor, like even though I was born and raised here. And then even when I go up north, and even though I know the landscape because like I've been there many times, throughout my adolescence years into like adult years, and it's like I'm still in a way considered a visitor, but that's also my homeland. And so it's kind of in some ways can be very telling of a lot of people in our community. And I think that even some of the more funny ones where she was talking about uh, recognizing people within the community who are kind of like that two world drifting type stuff, we're still able to get a lot of the things that are in here. And so that's just like another thing that comes with like being a modern day native person. And so um, it's still a very good like document, almost to like reference um for like young kids to be like, here, like read this book, and I'm sure that they would take as much as way as like a 32-year-old would, And so I like that it's like document enriched and that it's very diverse.
Hmm. Yeah. I think like thinking about how this fits into the Arizona like traditional like literary
Hmm.
sphere. I think it's definitely for me, it's definitely something that I've never read. In terms of just the diversity of like all these different stories into one book. And it's just really refreshing to see that because a lot of the stories do talk about trauma, and but she does a really good job with balancing that in a way that makes it, I don't know if like hopeful is the right word, but I just think of like the word heart. Like there's still like it's like a safe space, if that makes sense. Like even though like there was some real heaviness to it, like maybe it's like the way she describes like the land, or I just love that she describes like land throughout, like even describing like through people and like the place they're at. But um I don't know, there's something really different about it. I remember I read Heartberries, and that
Mm,
one that one's a book about trauma, and I remember very beautifully written, but it was very like heavy to read. And this was still like a very serious read, but I still felt warmth in that.
yeah.
So that's something I really appreciated.
Hmm. It's funny that you say that. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues the other day. And I was like, I feel like a lot of our conversations are like, like we're talking about like heavy stuff, and a lot of the times like we're able to kind of kind of like float on that, and like that's how the conversation continues. And I was explaining that to her, and I said, in a way though, I don't want to do that with you. I said that because that's the kind of trauma bonding I don't want to continue. I said I'd rather talk about your successes. And so, the way that you had described that, it was still heavy, but you still had a lot of hope. It was like when we do talk about like traumas, especially like in our community, because a lot of those things, if you're not really careful about, just like generational wealth and stories, if you're not careful about how you look at it and how you read it, you can still continue the things that are bad, or you continue the things, that are good. And so, And that way I was just like saying, you know, I'd rather talk about the successful parts of things that we have come out, you know, with trauma, even if it's still within us, like we're still successful people.
Mhm.
And so I like the constructiveness of these stories because that was like probably maybe Stacie's way of like saying like yes we can like talk about trauma but not trauma bond and like just have that be the main thing of our that stirs the conversation, but we can also include stories of success too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think like every person within the book was like very hardworking and like all of them had a sense of like survival, and then also just like thriving too. Um, I'm trying to like think of they were
Um,
all really good.
there's a passage in here, and I'm trying to see where the post-it is. Oh, right here. So, um, this dam was an oasis for those trees, the dandelions, dots of morning glory, and the fluorescent algae growing in what was left of the summer monsoon. Desert plants were resilient that way. They were short and looked nearly dead, but beneath the alkaline soil, where most plants couldn't grow, their roots clenched into the earth like wiry brown fists. And so, um, you know, I think that how we like really try to like put our finger on like on whatever topic that we're like talking about. I feel like in a lot of discussions with like Native and Indigenous scholarship, it always like comes back to land because I
Mhm.
think that the observations were are there. Like they're just there as long as you observe them. And so like the observation made about like the desert and being able to flourish and even a seemingly barren landscape, there's still room to examine the existing landscape around it. And even if you have to go beneath it, what is the things that you're gonna pull out to where you're like doing this? And so it was kind of it gave that kind of um, imagery in my head, but it's also we're people that have learned from our landscape in that way, and we are people that do acknowledge our plant relatives, our animal relatives, and so it's like a community of learners. And so I think that with this book in particular, does a really good way of examining how we have grown as people, and especially kind of that yearning to kind of go back to that because we never lost it. It's just like we'll receive it back in little pieces, even if it's language or the observation with like desert plants or like that. It's just always like something that is the hopeful thing that we're trying to explicate about our conversations.
Mhm. Yeah, I really love that passage that you brought up. Just, I think it's also nice, just as like a reminder whenever I'm struggling, I like remember my mom, I remember my grandma and like the struggles they went through. And I'm like, I come from like a really strong line of women. And
Hmm.
so I love that, it's always back to land and that like sacredness of it. And as I'm like working at the Labriola Center, I'm like, I feel really grateful to be learning like so much more about my own history, but also other histories of like within Arizona too. And um like I came across this book about the Long Walk. It was by I think it was by Diné College, and they had like gone around and done interviews with elders who talked about like what happened. And I just like I never read that book before, but just hearing those stories and like knowing that we just had hope and that we kept fighting for, we always thought of a future even though it didn't seem like there was one. And how important like having our traditional homelands is and like how that kept us going as a people.
Hmm.
So yeah, I really love that each of these stories had something to tell in relation to land and just like their own experiences with family, because there's some complicated like characters in here, and like I'm thinking of like the casket in the back seat,
Oh yeah.
like infidelity. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, like that was just I really like that story because I've been reading like what's his Stephen Graham Jones The Only Good Indians, and so it's kind
Mm.
of refreshing having like a ghost story that's not like so haunting.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and the way that she tells it is like, you know, he has unfinished business, and I guess like I don't know, I thought it was interesting. Like, do you think that it was resolved because he never got to actually speak to him, but like it was the relationship through his grandson. And so I thought that was kind of interesting that he could get to his grandson, but
Mm.
not really his daughter.
Hmm. So now I'm gonna try to not start crying. So my as you might remember, like the last poetry that reading that I did, my uncle had passed away, and so a lot of since that time period, it's been kind of like a lot of learning about our family and like making sure that I'm having those stories when I like into the future, and I'm at least documenting it somehow, or like I'm texting like my dad or whatever. And during that time period, I had reached out to my cousin sister, because like it's also her uncle that had passed away. And so we're like, talking about our grandpa, and like at least we'll feel like comforted that he'll be with grandpa, things like that. And she was like, I never really heard stories about our Nully because my dad, who is also my uncle, because I have five uncles, um, never talked about him. And I was just like, why? Like my dad talked about him all the time. And that was how we were raised on my grandpa's stories, and how we were able to get through a lot of challenges in our lives was remember what grandpa say, even though like I was only a baby when he had passed away, but whenever I would get that reminder, remember what grandpa would say, and then I would just like, stand a little bit straighter because, I was told stories about like what he would say in those instances and how to prepare myself type of thing. And so she was like, but even though I didn't hear those stories, my son does from my dad. And
Mm.
she said that when he, what do you call it? When he repeats the stories that my dad tells him about grandpa, it's as if he knows him. So much like how, like, I feel like I know my grandpa. Maybe it skipped a generation with her, but it remains in her son. And so, she was like, I think that he never told me those stories because he was sad that his dad passed away. And so like when I think about that, I'm like, how, especially because the story talks about grief a lot and how we mourn and how they manifest. Um, Sometimes it's like a point of privilege where like people are able to receive things like that, those instances of generational wealth and how they're able to impact your life. And so it's like being able to at least have somewhat of that carried on in the son. And maybe in the instance that it was presented in this book is similar in that nature, is that even though it skips a generation, it still somewhat finds its way to at least latch on to a life that's still within that family tree. And so I think maybe like if we think about the world and how things happen, it's like there's still like a reason for everything. And so that was kind of like how I read that passage a little bit and it's funny because books are reflective of like what you're going through at the time too. And so when that was going on, I was like, oh geez, like why is this calling me out right now? Hmm. But yeah, I guess that's how I kind of took that away. Not something that would be like, oh man, like it was a missed opportunity, but um, it's still powerful enough that even if it misses an opportunity, that it continues on with somebody else.
Yeah, I like that. Um, I remind me if like this is inaccurate or not, but like at the end of the like when everyone's at his funeral, is his other son there too?
Um, I was a little confused because it made it seem like, and how I read it, I think it was that he was just kind of recalling it by
Mm,
remembering Celestina. I think that's her name, Celestia.
yeah.
Um, and then how he kind of had, regrets and stuff like that, and like wishful thinking. I think that's kind of how I read it.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I was kind of thinking like, oh wow, they're like all in the same room together. Like that's wild.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of funny because like my I learned from my mom that my grandpa he was originally married to someone and then I don't know exactly how, but I think they got a divorce maybe, but he then remarried my mom's mom, so my grandma.
Hmm.
And so there's kind of that I thought that was interesting because I was just like I don't know, I guess as humans, maybe we think like, oh, this is my story. Like I feel like no one else is experiencing it, you know? But
Hmm.
then when I read that, I was like, this is actually like a really common thing. And I don't think my mom's ever like reached out to his side of the family, but she told me there was a moment where like my grandma was not happy about this situation and for years there was like some like tension between them and then when my mom was a teenager she was out with my grandpa and his son from his other family approached him and my grandpa kind of looked at my mom was and I don't know. I guess he was kind of nervous, didn't know what she would think. And then she just told my dad, like, it's okay. You guys can like sit down and like have lunch. And so they got to like be able to spend time with each other. Um, and I don't know, I guess that's where I was thinking like maybe the family at the end, like there was some sort of resolution of like acceptance that, they shared like the same person who passed away, but yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting moment when I was reading this. I was like, wow, that just reminds me of my grandpa.
Hmm. I think even if it wasn't like explicitly written that way, because I don't, in a way, like I kind of don't think that the way I read it was how maybe it was intended from the speaker. But the really neat thing about parts of this book is that it kind of has that phantom presence where you can kind of like fill in like with your own experiences, like
Mm.
what the outcome is, and or like be reflective about um, that fourth space that the author has written into the book. And so, if that was something that you took away from it, then I think that's the right answer.
I like
Hmm.
that. Yeah. Um, I guess like were there any other stories that stood out to you or any other questions
Let's see here.
you want to go over?
Well, I guess we could probably talk about the main one, the missing morning star. Um,
Hmm.
and so I was when I read it again, um, like we just passed MMIW in May, and so I had did a programming at our library where I made like a felt doll. I had basically designed this doll of a jingle dress dancer and with like long braids and like earrings and like a shawl and like those big chunky belts and the red scarf. And I was
Mhm.
thinking about um, the fact that within the programming, my intention was to talk about safety and safety, and also how like because it was a youth programming, how a youth person could bring about safety within their lives, whether if it's like building up their self-confidence to seek an adult's attention or seek an adult's help, that the confidence level would allow those words to kind of come out. And also like a safe thing for us to do as like Native people is to like have prayer. And so like during the activity, um, having somewhat of a prayer like written in my head and then burning creosote because that's the medicine that's in our region, the shiggy, and so
Mhm.
having that available and burning that there and then talking about um, unfortunately, Tucson is the top 10 most affected city in the United States of MMIW occurrences. And I think even Phoenix is even within that top 10 cities affected by that. And so when I was reading the story, and in terms of like, it was a young lady, Charmaine, that was like affected by, being perpetrated upon. Um, you really, without like getting into like the gory details of like trafficking and things like that, um, like how is it that we instill like even in our own communities what safety looks like, in combination with all of the little complications that we have within our families, even in the mix of like even the Western constructs of like gender roles and like women and like men ideologies, all of these different things, because then in the end somebody might get harmed. And so this was just kind of one of those stories that like made me think about all of those different things, especially since towards the end of the story, it was given to us that the girl who was like the butch girl who's like talking about Charmaine, she's basically saying that when she had found Charmaine, it was like she was almost like helping birth like a child because even in the stories before, they're all like a good they butcher sheep well, or they deliver sheep well. And so it's like thinking about how are we like molding our little ones and like
Mhm.
what kinds of things are they being born into type of thing. And even if even in that phrase where a lot of religious people say, "Oh, I'm born again Christian," or like when people are born again, even in their adult years, what would that even look like, or what kinds of things would you even say to someone who is born again, even if it was out of like trauma or things like that? And so, just a lot of reflecting, I guess, in this, especially since like I work with a lot of like tweens, and so those are a lot of things that I've been thinking about lately and how to incite well-being.
Yeah. Um, Going along with what you said about the sheep and like birthing, like um I love what you said about molding, like within our puberty ceremonies, someone who is esteemed within your family, like, and they're the one who molds you.
Hmm.
And so I thought that was interesting that when um Charmaine was being taken out of like literally like mud, like she's stuck in mud, like that's a form of like clay and like molding
Like,
someone. And then I think of like when I think of our relationship with sheep, like as women, like we're kind of like guardians over sheep, and like sheep also in other cultures like represents like an innocence. And just thinking about like
wow, I love that connection. Mm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like thinking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, like there's an innocence that is taken, and like we're trying to protect, our children, and yeah, when you're violated that innocence of,
Mm-hmm.
that violation, it just corrupts you, and like you might feel like really dirty and unclean, and so
Mm-hmm.
that aspect of being like born out of the mud, kind of like when you mentioned that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Um, but yeah, that was just some thoughts I had.
Yeah. Um, because like with the MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives too, because that happens, to all of our community, all community. We're not limited to a lot of different things, but with that, it's like we like in that regard, in that cultural perspective, we are shepherds, like how you're saying, like and like religious figures, it's like people are shepherds, and we are matrilineal society, and so I think that sometimes when things come into like Western perspective, like yes, like this is probably not like a well-known thing, but they probably don't really know what the articulation is. So it's like oftentimes the people in these movements are women, and it's like we're trying to like uh develop more scholarship around it. We're trying to develop more articulation around it. We're trying to develop like an organizing around it. And so in that way, like how you were saying, we are like shepherding that whole thing in a way. And so again, like we're like returning to some of the things that were like given to us by like the holy people. And so it's like I don't think that a lot of people really realize how inherent like the religious aspect of our being is always going to be explicated in even something like this, or even like as we approach written documents, or even our own scholarship, it's always going to have that kind of religious element to it.
Mhm. I really like this question. Each of you is an artist. How does this book or this author inform your own creative journey?
Oh gosh. So I'm all like, I feel like the only creative thing that I can really do as of lately is that I will have 40 hours dedicated to like library life. And so all of my creativity goes to programming. And so since you're here, this is one that I had made. This is a notebook we're gonna do with our kiddos, because it's like back to school stuff. And
Yeah.
so this is on the inside of this is a cracker box. I think it's like farmhouse cookies or like crackers or something. And then this is just like regular letter paper. And so like the only thing like I feel like these days has always just been like programming, like in terms of like creativity, because
Mhm.
everything else goes to like library stuff. And then by the time that I get home, the only creative thing that I really do is just put my feet up and then like on the couch and then like watch TV. But it's always good talking to you, Yitazba. Even though I don't see you often, but every time that I see you, it's always a good thing. And then we're always crying too.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure like seeing you, Lindsay. Like, I love hearing like your thoughts, your expressions, and I feel very grateful that I got to spend some time with you today because I know in library world, like we're constantly busy, so it's really great to touch bases with you and just discuss a really great book.
hmm Yeah, and it's a really good like how we're saying, it's a rest. Like we got to take a break from our library stuff and actually just talk about a book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for tuning into the Arizona Center for the Book's Southwest Book Chats. These conversations may have inspired you to explore the beauty of Arizona, cultivate beauty in your own backyard, or seek diverse Arizona stories. Our state has a rich literary heritage that can be explored through your local library's online and in person services. This project is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives and Public Records, a division of the Arizona Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services.